is perhaps Hooksjaw's gratuitous, but there's a difference. And it may not have been the most important element, but you know, these humans are on Hooksjaw's breeding ground. They want to drill for oil. They're on his turf, and he's going to get rid of them. So, in that sense, there's a polarity and there's a conflict which I don't remember existing in Kids Are All OK. Similarly, in Dredger, there's a kind of conflict and a story dimension to it, because you have the old way of doing things, the John le Carré kind of spy, but there's the modern spy, the dirty, gross mercenary, Dredger, who gets things done. And that's a conflict between the old and the new. Now, I don't recall there being that same subtext in Kids Are All OK. Perhaps it was there, perhaps I'm being unfair.
Thoughts of things about Look Out for Lefty and Sports Not for Losers.
Okay, let me take a swig and you can obviously edit out my... Yeah. Okay.
Just zoom in on the bottle.
If you want to make more general, which you are doing, but if you want to make more general views on just what was going on around these stories, and just in the outside world, and that'd be that'd be quite good.
All right. Well, Sports Not for Losers. Now, I have no sports background, but I knew that I needed to do something different with sports. It was no good just doing a kind of, I don't know, a kind of Roy of the Rovers kind of thing. I had to say something new, and I talked to people who are into football a fair bit, and we did actually explore a number of ideas which didn't work, you know, sort of ended up on the cutting room floor. I talked to Dave Hunt, who's a serious, very, very, really into football in a major way, and I said, what about if we do a dramatisation of a real-life footballer? Who would you pick? And he said, I think he said Jackie Charlton would be the one to go for. And I sort of explored that, and I talked to a sporting agency and saw whether it would be possible to dramatise his life in that way. Because, you know, he'd come from sort of humble origins and so forth. And for one reason or another, it didn't work out. And so then I thought, okay, I need to say something else. What about the merchandising, which was really starting to come into football at that time? In other words, you know, people were starting to go in for sponsorship. And this was all relatively new in the 70s. Now, of course, we take it for granted. And I think if one was to do a story today about a kind of Beckham-type figure, it would probably go down very well. So this, in a way, was almost a prototype for that. And I had the best artist. I mean, he is probably Britain's top football artist, Barry Mitchell. And his stuff is fantastic. I mean, it really moves. But the script didn't really live up to that feeling, and it was very, very well written, very professionally, I think, by Ron Carpenter, as I recall. But if you're going to make something like that work, you've got to have a bit of an agenda. You've got to have a bit of, I don't know, anger inside. You've got to say, you know, in other words, you either object to sponsorship or it's something that you want to get off your chest. And I don't think the writer did. In other words, he wrote a very balanced story, but it was a little bit too laid back. And the successful action stories have all got that kind of energy and anger behind them.
How did the reader response and the sales figures affect you and the other writers?
Well, first of all, the reader response to action was very, very good. There was an awareness that we were doing something new that hadn't been done before. And it was very encouraging, because we weren't talking down to the readers, and you can see that in every page of action. I mean, even down to the effect that I would insist that we actually photocopy the original letters, so you see the original letters on the page in some cases, because there had been a tradition of making up letters in comics, and I wanted to show that this is a genuine publication. The reader's response generally was to go for very proactive characters, which was good, and to really thumbs down on any character who was not proactive. And that came as a bit of a shock to me. Because, for instance, The Fugitive, a guy who's running away from danger, it's a very successful TV show. And so when we did The Running Man, which was like The Fugitive, the guy's on the run from the mafia, beautifully drawn, very well written, lots of interesting things going on. Readers just didn't like it, or didn't like it enough. Some of them liked it, but not many.
Did the use of the reader poll really help in terms of feedback in deciding which stories to develop,
Yes.
which stories to drop?
The reader poll, people will question the validity of the reader poll, and have done since, and said, well, there were other readers who liked it, but they didn't write in. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. I think the reader poll was a pretty fair judge. In this day and age, and in more recent times, not so. Because by then the readership was becoming older, more sophisticated, and whatever. But back then, the reader poll was pretty accurate. So if they liked Hookjaw, they all voted for Hookjaw, that was the one. And if they all hated The Running Man, okay, you just got to bite the bullet and accept that that's how it is. But it was a shock to me that the characters had to be totally proactive. And increasingly, we realised that the more, not so much proactive, but the more extreme they were, the more the readers liked them. It was almost a reaction to all those middle-of-the-road, rather tedious stories that had gone before.
Following on from that, do you think that the decision to increase the violence and to make the comic more challenging was a good idea or a bad idea in retrospect?
I think it obviously went too far. I think if there had been one long-term editor running it all the way through, it would have survived its various problems, because the sales on it were very, very good indeed. But I started it off and then handed it over to an editor who left after, I think, a relatively short period of time, and then another editor took over who didn't have a background of this kind of fiction. So there was no real guidance there, but there was a sense of, okay, if we make it more extreme, it will be more popular. I think there was a balance, and obviously it crossed the line. It crossed the line in several areas. And of course at that time, comics were really being scrutinised by various media pundits like Mary Whitehouse. So yeah, it was really like there wasn't a driver. I think that was the problem with action. It was heading wherever it was going to head, so inevitably it's going to end up in the river.
I think it would be good if you could put in your anecdote about Mary Whitehouse as well.
Okay, oh yeah, that's right. I'm trying to remember which story it was I was working on now. I think it was probably Hookjaw. I'll make it Hookjaw anyway. Yeah, I mean in those days, Mary Whitehouse, I think, she was, her view was important, and things like Doctor Who, I think, were in trouble if they had things too scary. And comics, people really didn't like comics in the media. They really disliked them. There's something very deep in British character, which I think goes back to school days of confiscating comics and tearing them up. We are rather a snobby culture. In a way that these things don't really matter in Europe. They don't understand it. So, Mary Whitehouse, curiously, actually lived near me in Colchester, in some village down the road. And I can remember on one occasion I was travelling up to London. I travel up to London every day, and I'd edit the stories on the train. And I'm sitting opposite her. And I'm editing Hookjaw and making it a little bit more lurid, and I'm sort of looking at her, and she's sort of just glancing across at me in a vague sort of way. Why is that long-haired git staring at me or something? And I remember writing in some extra lurid detail and saying to myself, this one's for you, Mary.
Following on from that, what do you what were your thoughts and feelings